The rapier is seen by many as the ultimate duelist sword of the Renaissance, but was it actually a murderer's weapon? Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, the YouTube channel, and of course the fencing clubs. Now, I fence a little bit with rapier, in fact increasingly so as the years have gone by, and I have experienced the formidableness of the rapier. It is a great type of sword, particularly for single one-on-one combat, and I've rated it as one of the best swords you could possibly choose for a one-on-one duel. Now, I set out to make a video about primary sources describing duels, particularly in London and the UK as a whole, from primary British sources, historical sources. However, what I found surprised me. There are tons and tons of records of these being used, not for dueling, but for murder. So in this video, we're going to look at some of the primary sources describing incidences in the late 16th and 17th centuries when rapiers were used for murders. But before we jump into those, let's have a quick word about our amazing sponsors for this video, who are the awesome Raid Shadow Legends. So the game that I play the most on my mobile phone is Raid Shadow Legends. I play regularly and you can play it for free right now. There's so many different ways to enjoy the game. There's campaigns, dungeons, faction wars, arena, clan bosses. You can build your team with hundreds of different champions, and there's a whole bunch of bosses to beat. Now, when you play or take part in events, you can win shards, and shards help you summon new champions. So what I'm going to do here is open up some of the shards that I've collected, and let's see who I get. Oh yes, so the Anchorer is really awesome. I've just checked out of his skills, and he can heal friends, he can attack enemies and take their hit points, and he can also remove buffs from enemies and put buffs on allies. Now I've got some sacred shards here. Oh. So my team's quite offensive, so she will fit perfectly into my playing style. She's an attacking player. Talia's great in attack. When she attacks, she stands a chance of putting a buff on herself and debuffs on the enemies. So for all new raid players, there's something really special for you right now. You get to vote on your favourite starter champion. Download the game right now using the links below, and then take your in-game player ID. Then go to championselect.plarium.com. Simply enter your player ID and select your favourite starter champion. Now the reason you want to do this is because there's in-game and real-life prizes to be won. The vote runs from January the 16th all the way through to February the 10th, and you stand to win epic and legendary champions, in-game prizes, and even Amazon gift cards up to the value of $1,000. When the vote ends on February the 10th, one champion will be selected as the winner, and the winners of the prizes will be selected via draw. And don't worry if you're an existing raid player, because you can still get involved. If you head over to championselect.plarium.com, you'll find a promo code there that you can use to get prizes in-game. There's something else special happening at the moment. That's Ronda Rousey. Ronda is in Raid, is a character. I've been using her. She's absolutely formidable, and you can get her. And it doesn't matter whether you're a new or a long-time player. All you need to do is log into Raid. Just play the game for 7 days between now and the 20th of February. And as a reward, you'll get Ronda added to your champions. Check the available promo codes for new and existing players down in the description. And if you haven't played Raid yet and you're just about to download it, wait, because I've got a special offer for you here. If you click that description down below under the video here, or scan the QR code on screen, then you can get bonuses worth $30. You're going to get a free epic champion called Coroner. You're also going to get 200k silver, 1 XP boost, 1 energy refill, and 1 epic skill tome. And all that treasure is going to be waiting for you up here in the inbox. And that's only for new players and only for the next 30 days. You can find me in game as Captain Context, and if you're quick enough, you can even join my clan, which is the 5-star army. And hopefully I'll see you in game. So let's get back to the main topic of this video and have a look at these sources describing rapiers used for murders. And do you know what, just for fun, I'm going to throw in a few examples as well of rapiers being used in fights, shall we say, self-defense. And that's the other important thing to say here. So the three main categories that I have found rapiers being mentioned in court proceedings, essentially, so criminal proceedings in British records, are duels, fights, and that's a different thing, so not a pre-arranged fight, but just, you know, a street fight, usually drunken, or involving members of the opposite sex, or involving disagreements about payments and things like that, so typical things that fights happen about, or murders. Now, It massively surprised me. As I say, I set out to make a video about primary accounts of duels with swords, thinking that some of these might be street fights rather than duels. But what I found was vastly outnumbering the records of either pre-organised duels or street fights breaking out unplanned. I found far more records of rapiers being used for murders, which completely surprised me. So here's a typical example. This example comes from the Middlesex Session Rolls of 1680, so it's fairly late. This is probably fairly late period rapier, could even be an early transitional rapier, so as we're moving towards the small sword. But it says that at St Margaret's in Westminster, County Middlesex, on the said day, Tobias Butler, gentleman, and Daniel Sehane, labourer, both late of the said parish, assaulted Nicholas Fitzsimmons, and that Tobias Butler slew and murdered the said Nicholas Fitzsimmons by giving him, with a rapier, a mortal wound in the left part of his breast, of which mortal wound he then and there died instantly. And that Daniel Sehane was present at the said murder and encouraged the said Thomas Butler to commit it, found guilty. So a simple example, you know, this could have been done with a knife, could have been done with a gun in modern times, but in this age when rapiers were worn and carried, it was therefore often the first go-to weapon to be used in this type of murder or ambush. Here's another example from the Middlesex Session Rolls of 1671, a true bill that at St Giles's in the Fields, County Middlesex, on the said day, Robert Constable Esquire, otherwise styled as Robert Viscount Dunbar, in the Kingdom of Scotland, Peter Savage Esquire, otherwise styled Peter Lord Savage, and Lord Fenwick Esquire, all three late of the aforementioned parish, assaulted one Peter Varnall, and that the said Robert Constable slew and murdered the same Peter Varnall by giving him with a rapier a wound on the right side of his head, of which wound he then and there died instantly. So this would suggest this wasn't a small sword, so a blow to the head is quite an interesting one. I guess this could have been a blow, this could have been a thrust, but it sounds more like a cut. So some kind of cut and thrust rapier. It goes on, essentially, they were found guilty of murder. Yet again, this is no description of a fight. There may have been a quarrel, but no, this wasn't a duel, this wasn't a weapon versus weapon fight. This was simply one person pulling out their sword and hitting another unarmed person, as far as we can tell, in the head. Moreover, an inquiry actually goes on with a later description of this, saying that the aforementioned Peter Savage and John Fenwick were present, aiding, maintaining, abetting the said Robert Constable to commit the said homicide. So just a clear-cut murder. Here's another example from the Middlesex Session Rolls, this one from 1684, under Charles II, and it's a true bill that at St Mary's le Savoy, County Middlesex, on the said day, John Lord Berkeley and John Berkeley, gentlemen, both late of the said parish, assaulted Ralph Toneycliffe, gentleman, and that the said John Lord Berkeley slew and murdered the said Ralph Toneycliffe by giving him with a rapier a mortal wound in and upon his belly near the navel, of which wound he languished in the said parish from the said 17th day of April to the 26th day of the same month. So more than a week, slightly less than, no, more than a week, of which last named day he died of the said wound, and that John Berkeley, gentleman, was present at the said felony and aided and encouraged John Lord Berkeley to perpetrate it. Found guilty of murder. So yet again, this is just simply, you know, it could have been a knife that was used, it could have been anything else, but in this case it was a rapier specifically being used as a tool of murder. Another example from the Middlesex Session Rolls, this one 1672, true bill that at St Giles in the Fields, County Middlesex, on the said day, John Hodgson, late of the said parish, gentleman, slew and murdered Edward Owen, gentleman, by assaulting him and with a rapier giving him on the left part of his breast a mortal wound, of which he then and there instantly died, presumably in the heart. Blah blah blah, essentially found guilty. So yet again, rapier used as the murder weapon. From the same year and the same session roll, here's another one, but in this case, John Skelton, gentleman, and Claudius de Vos, Harris, labourer, both late of the parish aforementioned, assaulted the aforesaid John Bull, and that John Skelton killed and murdered him by giving him with a rapier a mortal wound in the left thigh near the groin, presumably hitting an artery, of which wound the said John Bull gentleman languished, not an artery in this case, from 7 a.m. Of the same 13th of April to 10 a.m. of the same day, so for 3 hours, at which last named hour he died of the said wound, so perhaps internal bleeding or just blood loss in general, and that the aforesaid Claudius de Vos Harris was present at the said murder and was aiding and abetting the said John Skelton to commit it. Straight up murder with a rapier, this time in the crotch. Now this is a slightly curious one. This one comes from the Middlesex session rolls again, much earlier, this one 1596, so we're in the time of George Silver and Saviolo and people like that now. The coroner's inquisition post-mortem taken at Hollowell Street in St Leonard's, Shoreditch, County Middlesex, now London, on view of the body of James Feake, there lying dead, with verdict that the aforesaid James Feake and a certain Gabriel Spencer, late of London yeoman, were together in the said parish at the dwelling house of Richard East, who was a barber, on the 3rd instant between 5 and 6 p.m. when they exchanged insulting words. So this is a little bit different, because here we've got something a bit more spontaneous and suggestion that there's some kind of fight, or at least verbal fight. Whereupon James Feake, having a copper candlestick in his right hand, held it with the intention of throwing it at Gabriel Spencer. I mean, it's a candlestick, what's he going to do? Yeah, okay, so this is mitigating circumstances, but still, it's a candlestick. A thrown one as well, it's not like he's jumping on him, who, having his rapier in its scabbard, with the same rapier and scabbard, gave the said James Feake, between the ball of his right eye and the eyebrow, so up here, a mortal wound which penetrated to the brain, of which wound the said James Feake languished from the said 3rd at Hollowell Street to the 6th, on which the last named day of which he died of the wound. So the suggestion is there was a disagreement. James Feake threatened to throw a candlestick at Gabriel, and Gabriel went, "Hey, stop that," and poked him in the eyeball with his sheathed rapier. I mean, it could have just been unfortunate, I guess. I mean, it's also really points out the fact that a chape on the end of a scabbard on a rapier can be quite small and pointy, and certainly if you stick it in someone's eye, that will put them off fighting. In this case, it killed the person. Whether we class this as murder, possibly not. Possibly he would have unsheathed it if he'd been intending to murder, but we'll say homicide, death by misadventure and disagreement. Now here's again one that seems to be more of a straight up murder. A true bill that, this is from the Middlesex Session Rolls 1673 again. The Middlesex Session Rolls are very fertile ground for these sorts of records. True bill that at St Leonard's, Shoreditch, County Middlesex, now London, on the said day, Lewis Thomas, gentleman, Arnold Williams, gentleman, and James du Bois, interesting name, Dutch maybe, gentleman, all three late of the said parish, assaulted one Richard Adams, and that the said Lewis Thomas, gentleman, slew and murdered the said Richard Adams by giving him, with a rapier, a mortal wound on his right thigh, of which wound the said Richard Adams there and then instantly died, which I can only conclude arterial. Okay, so we're looking at inside of the right thigh, blood everywhere, dead within seconds. And that Arnold Williams and James du Bois encouraged and aided Lewis Thomas to commit the said murder, found guilty. Seems to be a straight up murder, perhaps not premeditated in the modern sense, but for whatever reason, three people ganged up on one. One had a sword, no suggestion that the person who died had a sword. Wounded in the right thigh, so maybe it wasn't intended to be mortal, but they've nicked the artery, dies of blood loss. And there, folks, is a good reminder that leg cuts can be more fatal and more quickly, sometimes, than chest or head cuts. Here's another relatively straightforward example from the Middlesex Session Rolls of 1676. A true bill that at St Andrews, Holborn, County Middlesex, now London, on the said day, Richard Hutton, late of the said parish, Esquire, assaulted Samuel Peachy, gentleman, and slew him by giving him with a rapier a mortal wound on the right part of his body, of which wound he then and there died instantly. So perhaps thrust in the heart. Richard Hutton put himself on the jury, no clerical note touching subsequent proceedings in the case. So I'm not sure what happened, whether he was found guilty or whatever else. Seems to be only one person armed. There's no mention of self-defense. There's no mention of the other person fighting back or having a weapon. Another example from the Middlesex Session Rolls, this one much earlier, 1588, a century earlier than some of the sources here. True bill that at St Giles, without Cripplegate in London, on the said day, Nicholas Sy, with malice aforethought assaulted, so this is premeditated murder, they'd decided, assaulted Thomas Daffy, I think his surname would be said, with a rapier, and murdered him by giving with that weapon a blow, of which he died instantly. We tend to think of a blow as a hit or a cut. A blow in this case could be any kind of assault really with the weapon, but nevertheless he died instantly of this wound, so either arterial or heart or brain, we can think. And they had declared that this was a premeditated murder where the opponent didn't fight back and probably didn't even have a weapon. So yet again, the rapier being used as an implement of premeditated murder. This is an interesting one because of the ending. So again, this is from the Middlesex Session Rolls. This is 1587, so even earlier yet again. And this is in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. True bill that Robert Brown, late of London yeoman, of the said 5th of December at St John Street, County Middlesex, now London, assaulted John Bray, gentleman. He, then being in God's and the Queen's peace, murdered him by giving him with a rapier a mortal wound in the left side of his body, of which wound the same John Bray died on the 15th. At the head of the bill, a memorandum that John Brown put himself as guilty and was sentenced to be hung, but that he was respited after judgment by the Queen's command. So he must have somehow known the right people in the right places and he got let off somehow. Maybe there were mitigating circumstances, maybe he was provoked, maybe the other person was armed somehow. We don't know. There's not any more detail for this one, unfortunately. Now, here's an interesting one for the location, and this is from 1656, so we've come forward to the middle of the 17th century again. And it's a true bill that at St Giles in the Fields, County Middlesex, now London, on the said day, Edmund Chamberlain, late of the said parish gentleman, assaulted Lancelot Grantham, what a fantastic name, gentleman, and with a rapier gave him in the right side of his back a mortal wound, of which he then and there died instantly. And Edmund Chamberlain was at large, so he'd done a runner, which would suggest, I think, that he knew he was going to be found guilty and didn't want to be hung or hanged. So anyway, that's an interesting one because it's the only one that I've seen here where it says that he was wounded in the back, which suggests that the person he stabbed was either walking away, turning away, or it was a surprise attack. We don't really know. It's possible you could be fighting with someone and you managed to get them in the back because of how you turn them, like an elbow push, or that they swing at you and over commit or whatever. It is possible. But I think when you've got a body with a wound in the back, it doesn't look good in court. Anyway, Edmund Chamberlain did a runner. He probably left the country and his descendants are probably living in Spain or France right now. So now we're going to look at a few examples which were a little bit more complicated, where it was more clearly a fight or possibly self-defense was involved in some cases. So here we have again the Middlesex Session Rolls from 1662, so not long after the English Civil War, and this is a coroner's inquisition post-mortem, so there's a dead body taken at St Andrews in Holborn, County Middlesex, now London, on view of the body of William Crop, gentleman, there lying dead and slain, with verdict that on the 9th instant, Edward Bridle, late of the said parish gentleman, was making his way up Chancery Lane, I used to work there, towards High Holborn, I used to work there as well, when the said William Crop, having a sword drawn in his right hand, assaulted the said Edward Bridle, So this is, you know, the other guy was, this wasn't a fight or a duel in this sense. One guy basically assaulted the other with his sword. And with the said sword, wounded him in the left arm, and then said, "Why do you not draw?" Now, isn't that a lovely detail? So basically, he wanted to fight this guy. They probably had some argument in an inn or at work or whatever, and he'd gone at him with his rapier and been, fight me, you mother... And the other guy had been like, "Go away, go home, you're drunk." and he'd pulled his rapier out and hit him in the arm and go, "Why won't you draw your sword? Will nobody fight me?" Highlander quote there. Anyway, and he says, "Why do you not draw? If you will not draw, I'll cut you to pieces." What a great quote that is, obviously from a witness. Whereupon the said Edward Bridle drew his rapier in self-defence, and that in the ensuing affray, fight, the said Edward Bridle, for the preservation of his own life, gave the said William Crop with the said rapier a mortal wound in the breast, of which wound he then and there died instantly. So, you know, honestly, assuming that this is true, assuming there were enough witnesses to verify this, then I'm with Edward here. It seems to me like Edward was very restrained and only pulled his sword out eventually when he was forced to, and it sounds like William Crop got what was coming to him. Now here's another classic example of a fight. This is in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1583, so this is, I think, the earliest source we've had here. Middlesex session rolls again. The coroner's inquisition post-mortem taken at the parish of St Martin in the Fields, which is near Trafalgar Square in central London, on view of the body of Oliver Andrews, late of London gentleman, who came to his death through a broil, a fight, essentially, that occurred between him and a certain Henry Sheppey on the 19th of January in the reign of Elizabeth I, between 4 and 5 p.m. near the mansion house of John Coppin in the public street of the same parish, when with his rapier the said Henry Sheppey gave the said Oliver Andrews on the fore part of his body, the front, and the left part of his belly, so round here, a mortal blow, of which he died on the 21st instantly, with verdict of jurors that the said Oliver Andrews, who drew his sword only in self-defence, was slain and murdered by Henry Sheppey. So again, self-defence is very important in English law at this time. This is a typical example of one person starting a fight and the other person pulling their sword out in self-defence. This is another pretty straightforward and simple example of a quarrel leading to bloodshed. This is from the Calendar of State Papers under James I, dated 1615. A verdict of manslaughter given by the jury against Lord Norris, we're talking about lofty individuals here, for having slain Jonathan Pigott, who was a servant of Lord Willoughby, so someone else important's servant, with a thrust of his rapier. Lords Willoughby and Norris having before had a quarrel, and Pigott having assaulted Lord Norris and his servant. So if this is true, if this is how it's actually what happened, then one servant probably doing something he shouldn't have done and getting stabbed by a lord as a result with a rapier. This is an interesting example from the so-called Cecil Papers, part of the Calendar of Cecil Papers in Hatfield House, dated 1602. So again, we're in the time of people like Silver and Swetnam and Saviolo. Since you're going to London, having some conference with my Lady Dymoke as concerning the abuses that was offered unto yourself and Mr. Brown by the two lords, I acquainted her ladyship with what I heard, which she was desirous you should have notice of, which was that after my Lord Clinton had taken your dagger and my Lord of Lincoln pulled Mr. Brown by the beard, both of which is already known to yourself, at your going down the stairs, my Lord Clinton and Mr. Edward Clinton, both of one instant, did draw their rapiers and run violently at you, which if one Mr. Edward Catesby, a follower of my lord, who was then in the chamber, had not defended one thrust with his hand, whereby he received a little hurt, he swears that you would have been slain. So this is an example, a great example, of someone not getting killed or even injured, well, mildly injured, thanks to someone else interposing their hand with interposing a thrust with their hand. And this is one of the important things about rapiers and small swords, is that thrusts particularly can be knocked aside, cast aside, and blades can be grabbed with the spare hand if you have a spare hand, and this is something that features heavily in rapier and small sword treatises. So here we've got another self-defense one. This is from 1595, the year that Saviolo was writing, making the first treatise in English, as it happens, on the rapier. And so Coroner's Inquisition post-mortem taken at St Martin's in the Fields, County Middlesex, London, on view of the body of Anthony Barnes, late of the said parish yeoman, there lying dead, with verdict that on the 9th instant, between the hours of 5 and 6 p.m, a certain James Pert, late of the said parish yeoman, was within the same parish and making his way in God's and the Queen's peace towards St Giles in the Fields, when the said Anthony Barnes, with his rapier drawn, made an assault upon him. Seems a bit random, unprovoked, and that James Pert vainly retreated from his assailant in order to escape from him. So, I tried to escape, officer, honestly. And that in the affray thus forced upon him, Sir James Pert, fighting lawfully in self-defence, and again that's very important legally at this time, certainly in England, fighting lawfully in self-defence and for the safety of his life, with his sword gave Anthony Barnes in the right part of his belly a mortal wound, presumably a thrust, of which he then and there instantly died. So again, this is what seems to be maybe a mugging, maybe it was provoked, maybe they knew each other. That just doesn't give us enough details to know. But premeditated in some way, assuming that this is true and this is how it panned out, rather than actually being a duel or an argument in the street, then this person acted in self-defense, killed the other person. It was fine. He was told to get along with his life, and well done for defending yourself. Now this one from the same source, 1595, is in fact another example just of an argument, but with mismatched weapons. And it's worth mentioning, this is far, far more common in these period sources where the two people don't have evenly matched weapons. Ergo, it's not a premeditated duel. It's not the type of fencing scenario that most of us do in our standard training. In this case, one person's got a rapier and the other person has a staff, aka quarterstaff. And so this is, as I say, 1595, a coroner's inquisition post-mortem taken at St Martin's in the Fields, Middlesex, on view of the body of John Langton, late of the said parish, cutler. So he was a knife maker, or at least a hilt maker. With verdict that on the 10th, between 3 and 4 p.m, the said John Langton and a certain Michael Pinky, late of the same parish, exchanged insulting words and had an affray. So they had a fight, had an argument in a certain place of the said parish. Michael Pinky fighting with a rapier and John Langton fighting with a staff. In which affray, Michael Pinky with his rapier gave John Langton on the upper part of his right arm a mortal wound. So, upper part of the right arm, a mortal wound. Presumably, I mean, it could have been the inside of the arm, so perhaps arterial. But anyway, I mean, yeah, you can get to arteries in the upper part of the arm, of which he died within a quarter of an hour. So, that's probably not arterial, but it's just blood loss, presumably. On his arraignment, acknowledging the indictment, Michael Pinky asked for the book, read like a clerk, and was delivered. Legal speak there. So, essentially this is a straight up fight, rapier versus staff, and rapier won. Now, I've made videos in the past saying how, the staff, the quarterstaff, can seem like an amazing weapon, but one of the fundamental problems with it is unless you clout someone in the head and knock them out, most blows with the staff, they might give you a nasty bruise, they might hurt an awful lot, they might wind you. At worst, they might break a bone or break your head, but a lot of hits with the staff are not going to put you immediately out of action. And here is a great historical example of a mere cut in the arm from a rapier. And no one really thinks of a rapier as a great cutting sword, but they can cut, and delivered with enough force, this was enough to kill this person within 15 minutes, and presumably therefore if they died in 15 minutes they'd already been incapacitated and put out of action by that wound. Now, as I've said, most of these affrays or fights that we see happen with mismatched weapons because they're not planned, they just happen in the street and people use whatever they happen to have, and not everyone at this time walked around with a sword, and not everyone certainly walked around with a rapier. So sometimes when we read these accounts, and I'll look at more fight accounts in the future, in a future video, but often they are mismatched weapons. So one person's got a backsword or a sword and buckler, the other person's got a rapier or rapier and dagger, as we just saw an example of a rapier versus a staff. Now this is an example of where both people have rapiers, as it happens by chance. So again, 1595, Coroner's Inquisition post-mortem taken at Stepney, County Middlesex, on view of the body of Richard Ashen, late of the county gentleman, with verdict that on the 27th between 5 and 6 p.m. the said Richard, this is June incidentally, 27th of June, the said Richard Ashen and a certain William Carville, late of London gentleman, being together at Stepney in the London field, exchanged insulting words, so they got in an argument, and drawing forth their rapiers, so they both had rapiers, made an affray with one another, had a fight, in which affray William Carville with his sword gave Richard Ashen a mortal wound, of which he then and there died instantly. A few interesting things there: the fact that they both had rapiers, the fact that they refer to the rapier also as a sword. So in this period we can't always take it to mean that if they say rapier or sword it means a specific type of sword. They can just say sword for a rapier. And also interesting that he died then and there instantly of whatever wound he received. It doesn't say the location in this case, but this is one of those cases where it wasn't a planned duel, but it played out a bit like a duel because they both had matched weapons. Right, this is the final example of a fight, an unplanned fight, definitely not a duel, where someone ended up dead, that I'm going to give. This is from the City Papers of Exeter in Devon, and this is from 1583. Now this is a fairly long account, so I'm going to abbreviate it and pick out certain bits. So this is actually a very lengthy account, of which I'm going to read the first part. What comes after is all of the other witnesses' version of the story, which is very interesting in itself, but it's too much detail for this video, I think. So here's the first version. Thomas Predox of Ashperton, gentleman, examined before the mayor and Nicholas Martin, justices, deposed that about 7 o'clock at night on August the 27th, 1583, he was at the south gate of the city, being Exeter, when Lewis Glavell followed him and charged him to have said certain days past that he, Glavell, did smell of ale. P said that he knew him not, and G said that P was a very knave and did strike him with his fist 2 or 3 blows, and then drew his dagger and again assaulted him. Wherewith P gave ground, backed up, and was driven back to the place of one Collins, who was a cutler just outside Southgate, and there was like to be slain by the said G, when P took a rusty rapier off Collins's stall to defend himself with. He then gave back again and received diverse blows, and went from P again into the wall of the late Greyfriars, there by Southgate, and never gave a blow to G, but G did run wilfully upon P's rapier, which he had taken from the stall. Now, I'm going to paraphrase what comes afterwards because it's really long and really detailed and it's multiple witness statements, but essentially P, who took the sword from the stall, G was assaulting him, punching him. The various other witness statements say that G essentially was punching him, pushed his nose up and pulled his hat down over his eyes. So he was properly beating him up. P backed away and tried to escape, and then as a last resort he took a rusty rapier from the cutler's stall and threatened, and in other witness statements it says verbally what he said, he verbally threatened G, at which point G went, "Ah!" and wrapped a coat around his left arm, presumably to try and parry the rapier as he charged in, and charged him with his dagger, and he charged in, and in charging in, basically gutted himself on the rapier's blade. Now, There are multiple, I think there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 or 7 witness statements to this incident. So we've got a fair idea of what happened, and pretty much, well, in fact, they all agree that G ran onto P's rapier. So it was an accidental death, and therefore P was completely, you know, wasn't charged with anything. He wasn't held guilty of murder or anything like that. It was G's fault, and G basically killed himself on P's rapier. But the interesting thing is that some of the witnesses do say that P issued some threats with the rapier. So he had intended the rapier to be a deterrent, a self-defense deterrent to the person with the knife who was punching and beating and threatening to stab him. So this is the final example. Now, my sort of conclusion to these accounts, and I haven't cherry-picked these. I have literally picked out about the first 20 or 30 hits that I found, and the ones that were suitable to be read onto camera, I read those. The ones which were just too wordy or not very clear what happened, I threw those away. So I haven't come across a single account yet today of the things I've been researching which I would describe as a duel. Every single one of these instances of the use of a rapier was either murder or it was affray. Let's call it affray. Okay, so some kind of incident, argument, hot-headedness. And in most of the hot-headedness cases, it wasn't necessarily equal. It was one person being the aggressor and the other person, in some cases, trying to escape the situation or just defend themselves. And moreover, only in one of these cases that I pulled out of the hat today, in only one of these was it rapier versus rapier. In all of the other cases, it was either rapier versus unarmed, rapier versus knife or dagger, or rapier versus something like a stick, or a staff, a quarterstaff. So make of that what you will. I think it's very interesting as a statistical analysis. We often think about these weapons, especially in HEMA and in fencing circles, we think of these as duellists' swords. We watch The Three Musketeers or Man in the Iron Mask, and we think about these being used rapier versus rapier in organised duels or in kind of skirmishes between different groups of people. And the fact is that these were worn around and carried around by all sorts of people of all classes, from tradespeople like cutlers and tailors and thatchers, all the way up to lords. And so therefore, because they were always at hand, much like in the modern world with knives, be it kitchen knives or any other kind of knife, they were often the go-to weapon either for murder or for having a fight within the street, an unorganised and very often drunken fight. You also have to bear in mind, of course, that to some degree this is just a matter of statistics. The fact is that crimes and acts of passion and violence as a result of drinking and disagreements and everything else are always more common than something like a formal duel. So, I hope that's been interesting to you. I will be looking for, because I do have some duels on record, I will be looking at the use of rapiers and other types of sword in this period, 16th and 17th centuries, and into the 18th with small swords as well, used in duels, because we get very, very, very different impression of these swords and their use when we look at the more organised sense of their use. And also I will be looking at more mismatched weapon set fights, because I have come across a bunch of those in the past, and in fact I've related some on this channel, but there are some really good accounts of people using back swords and sword and buckler and stuff like this against rapiers, particularly in the between about 1550 and 1590, after which rapiers become more common than things like back swords. But I will dig out some of those sources as well in future videos, but I hope for now this has been interesting for you. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be, and I hope I will see you back on the channel really, really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.